Chapter 20, Dead Peter Has His Gold. That night we had a big supper. I stood behind the king's chair and waited on him, and the servants waited on the rest. After supper, the king asked Mary Jane about sleeping rooms. She said Uncle William could have the spare room, and she would give her own room to Uncle Harvey, for it was a bigger room. She would sleep on a cot in the room with her sisters. Up garret was a little cubby with a pallet in it. The king said this would do for his valley, meaning me. I lit out for bed as soon as I had supper. When I got by myself, I went to thinking. I had to save that money for the girls. There was only one way to do it. I had to steal the money somehow. Steal it and hide it. Then by and by, when I was away down the river, write a letter to Mary Jane where it was. But I must steal it tonight. It wasn't likely that the doctor had let up on them. And if he scared them bad enough, they might run away with the money before day. Upstairs, the hall was dark, but I found the Duke's room and started to paw around it. Then I thought the king wouldn't be likely to let the money out of his hands. So I went to his room and began to paw around. About that time, I heard them coming up the stairs, and I skipped behind a curtain. They walked in and shut the door. The king said, "Well, what is it? Cut it short. We ought to be down there whooping up the morning instead of up here giving them a chance to talk it over. I tell you, it ain't easy. The doctor worries me. He better glide out of here before morning, and he'd be satisfied with what you got." The king rips out and says, "What, march off like a couple of fools and leave $8,000 or $9,000 in property? All good sellable stuff?" The Duke grumbled, said 6,000 cash was enough, said it was blamed foolishness to stay with the doctor hanging over them. But the king said, "Curse the doctor. What do we care for him? Haven't we got all the fools in town on our side? And ain't that big enough majority in any town?" Then the Duke said, "I don't think we put that money in a good place." But the king said it was all right, because a servant only makes up the feather bed and wouldn't turn over the straw tick more than twice a year. I had the bag of money out of there before they could get downstairs and groped up to my cubby. I judged I had better hide the money outside the house. When they missed it, they would give the house a good ransacking. I waited until I heard the king and the Duke come up, and everything was still downstairs. Then I crept up to their doors and listened. I could hear them snoring. I went back for the bag of money and crept downstairs. The men watching the corpse had gone to sleep in their chairs. I tiptoed on through to the front door. It was locked and the key wasn't there. Just then, I thought I heard somebody coming down the stairs. I took a swift look around, and the only place I saw to hide the bag of money was in the coffin. I shoved the lid and tucked the bag away, down beyond where the hands crossed. The hands felt so cold it made me creep, and I got out of there as fast as I could. When I got back to my bed, I thought, when we get down to the river, 100 miles or so, I'll write back to Mary Jane and can dig him up and get the money. Next morning, when I went downstairs, the parlor was shut up and the watchers had gone. Nobody was around but the family and the widow Bartley and our own tribe. I watched their faces to see if they had missed the money, but I couldn't tell. Toward the middle of the day, the undertaker came with his man. They set the coffin in the middle of the room and put rows of chairs all around the walls. Then the people flocked in. For half an hour, they filled the round slow in a single rank and looked down on the dead man's face. It was all very still and solemn. The girls and the king and the Duke bent their heads and sobbed in their handkerchiefs. Then the undertaker slid around with his soft, soothing ways, getting people seated. He made no more noise than a cat as he moved people around, squeezed in latecomers, and opened up passageways, doing it with nods and signs made with his black gloved hands. He was the softest, glidingest man I've ever seen, and there was no more smile to him than there is to a ham. When everything was ready, the Reverend Hobinson got up to talk, slow and solemn. Right after he opened up, the most outrageous row busted out in the cellar. It was only one dog, but he made a powerful racket and kept it up. The parson had to stop. He just stood over the coffin and waited. The undertaker made a sign to him as much as to say, "Don't you worry, just depend on me." Then he went gliding along the wall behind the rows of chairs, and when he had gone around two sides of the room, he went through the door. In about 2 minutes, we heard a whack, and the dog finished up a howl. Then everything was dead still, and the parson took up his solemn talk where he left off. In a minute or two, here comes the undertaker back, gliding along the walls again. He shaded his mouth with his hands and stretched his neck out toward the preacher and said in a hoarse whisper, he had a rat. Naturally, the people had wanted to know. Little services like that don't cost anything and make a man liked. The funeral was very good, but pissin' long and tiresome. And last, the job was through, and the undertaker sneaked up on the coffin with his screwdriver. I was in a sweat and watched him pretty keen, but he didn't meddle, just slid the lid along and screwed it down. So there I was. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. How was I to know whether to write Mary Jane? Suppose she dug him up and didn't find anything? What would she think of me? Blame it? I said to myself. I wish to goodness I had let it alone. Dad fetched the whole business. They buried him and we went back home, and I went to watching faces. I couldn't rest easy, but the faces didn't tell me anything. That evening, the king visited around and sweetened everybody up and made himself ever so friendly. He let it be known that his church in England was in a sweat for him to come back, so he must settle the estate right away and leave for England. He was very sorry he was so pushed. He wished he could stay longer, but it couldn't be done. He said, of course, he and William would take the girls back to England with them. That pleased the girls, so they clean forgot they had ever had a sorrow and told him and to sell out as quick as he wanted to. Well blamed if the king didn't build a house and the slaves on and all the property for auction right off sale. 2 days after the funeral, but anybody could buy beforehand if he wanted to. Next day along about noon, a couple of slave traders came along. The king sold them the slaves cheap for a 3-day draft. 2 sons were sold up the river to Memphis, and the other mother down the river to New Orleans. The poor girl cried and said they hadn't dreamed of seeing the family separated or sold anyway from that town. I can't get it out of my memory. The sight of a poor miserable girls and the slaves hanging around each other's neck and crying. I would have busted out and told our gang if I hadn't thought the sale was no account and the slaves would be back in a week or 2. The thing made a big stir in town, too. A good many people came out flat-footed and said it was wrong to separate the mother and children that way. It injured the frauds some. But that old fool king bullied right along, in spite of all the Duke could do. I tell you, the Duke was powerful uneasy. After daylight, the morning of the auction, the king and the Duke climbed up to my garret and waked me up. I saw by the look on their face there was trouble. The king said, "Have you been in my room?" "No," I said. "Have you seen anybody go in there?" I studied a while and saw my chance. "Well, I saw the slaves that you sold go in there several times." "What? All of them?" "I don't think I ever saw them all come out at once, except one time. It was the day of the funeral. They tiptoed out. I saw they had shoved in there to do up your room, thinking you out, but found you in there asleep. At least they seemed to be trying to get away without waking you." "Great guns," said the king. They both stood there thinking and looking pretty sick and silly. The Duke said, "They let on to be sorry they had to leave. Oh yes, mighty sorry. And to think you sold them for a song. Is something gone wrong?" I said, kind of timid-like. The king whirled on me and ripped out, "None of your business. You keep your head shut and mind your business. You keep your head shut and mind your own affairs. Long as you are in this town, don't forget about that. You hear?" Then he said to the Duke, "We got to swallow it and say nothing." As they started downstairs, the Duke said with a little raspy chuckle, "Quick sale and small profit. It was good business, yes. If you had listened to me, they would be here yet, and we wouldn't." The king snarled around on me and sassed back, and then leapt into me again. Why hadn't I come and told him I had seen them come sneaking out of his room? Any fool would know they were up to something. They went off a-jagging, and I felt glad I worked it off onto the slaves, and yet hadn't done them any harm by it.